Welcome, everyone. This is an interactive panel. We're presenting on COVID-19 research pivots, and we're focusing on lessons learned from those research pivots. And my name is Allison Lombardi, and I'm from the University of Connecticut. I'm one of the PIs on the panel that will talk about my project and research pivots specifically. But we do have a fabulous panel lined up of PIs, and what we will do, because this is an interactive session, is we will allow each panelist to first talk about their project, their research pivots, and what lessons they learned, and present that very briefly to the group, to the audience. And then we will spend the bulk of the time fielding questions from the audience and having a discussion about the research pivots. So really that's going to be probably the majority of the time will be spent that way. So I will let each panelist introduce themselves as they talk about their project. So they'll introduce themselves and talk about their project, and then we will move on to the next panelist. And then again, we'll open it up for questions. So we're going to start with Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. I'm Hannah Schertz. I'm a professor of special education at Indiana University. And as it says here on the slide, we are running a Goal 2 planning project. And the focus of this project has been to develop and now to pilot test a framework of support for community-based early intervention providers in the field. And just to provide a bit of context on our focus, we have a threefold focus. First, the early intervention providers in the field work through parents rather than directly with toddlers. I think I said that this is specifically toddlers with autism, yes. So they work with parents rather than directly with toddlers. And this is accomplished by providing a conceptual grounding rather than providing specific strategies for parents to emulate. It's not that they provide a lot of information, but it's not strategy oriented so much as concept oriented. The second focus is that the providers work exclusively on developmentally ordered pre-verbal social communication content, which is the core concern for toddlers with autism. And then third, providers are helped to follow a process of mediated learning to encourage meaningful social engagement on the child's own volition, rather than using the more typical early intervention strategies of eliciting specific behaviors through directing or modeling or prompting strategies. So we're currently in the final phase of the planning project, in which we're implementing a single case design with 12 provider and parent, or 12 provider parent toddler triads. So we're collecting data on the providers, the parents, and the toddlers. And these 12 providers are working in Indiana and Kansas. So our original plans were for EI providers, early intervention providers, to conduct weekly sessions in family homes. But of course, this changed and to virtual last year. I'm losing track of the timeline for when the first surge happened. But although our consultation with providers didn't change, of course, the providers' work is what had the most change. And that was that they had to pivot to virtual sessions with families instead of their home-based sessions. And however, then they returned to home-based intervention as the initial surge initially ebbed, and then again had to move back to virtual delivery with the recent Omicron surge, although that wasn't universal. Some continued home visits, I believe. So as far as challenges are concerned, more than the challenges that are listed here that were mentioned when this slide was prepared, the problem of retention became a stronger challenge with this last Omicron surge. And that was because even though, COVID was milder, it affected more people. And in fact, in December and January, all 5 of our currently active triads were directly affected by COVID. Either families had COVID or providers had COVID, or in some cases, both had COVID. And so this was very disruptive to the intervention. Many sessions were missed, and we saw a sharper increase in families leaving early intervention altogether. And that was the even bigger problem than missed sessions, or that has been. It's currently a problem. And so the intervention consultant who's working with the providers reported that this attrition really appeared related to family stress and disruption of family routines, such as daycare related quarantines, resulting in their perception that they just don't have time and they become overwhelmed by all the disruptions. So we're all familiar with what those are, such as, for example, daycare related quarantines or family employment related disruptions. So anyway, that's what has resulted in the higher level of attrition compared to our research in previous projects, and also in the earlier phases of the current project. However, there were some benefits. We did see benefits from providers working virtually with families. And importantly, this virtual model supported the first focus I mentioned of early intervention providers supporting parents in the primary role of facilitating toddler social learning. So this shift to parents in a central role from a secondary or observing role to a central role was harder to accomplish when providers had easier access to toddlers themselves in face-to-face visits. And it was also hard for them to accomplish because they had to transition from when they entered our project, the providers had to transition from a traditional role to a parent-centered role, a family-centered role. They would have considered themselves family-centered in either case, but this was a more radical version of a family-centered model. And the shift to virtual delivery also supported the third focus, which was the mediated learning process, which relied on their providing a conceptual foundation rather than modeling specific strategies for parents to emulate. And this is part of the intervention by design. We want parents to have a good understanding of the content of the intervention and the process of intervention, so that then they have flexibility to interact with their toddlers in very flexible ways that is consistent with their own values, their own priorities, and with the toddler's interests. So we want them they really have an important role in determining what the strategies will be, rather than copying strategies that have been modeled for them specifically. However, we do have it's not that they don't have strategies. We do have provide video examples and written examples and verbal examples of what we call ideas other parents have used. So from those, we're presenting ideas of how other people have interpreted these concepts in ways that are appropriate for their own lives, and then we use that as a jumping off point for how the current parents might translate the concepts in their lives. So the purpose of mediated learning is to support active learning, toddler active engagement in the learning process. And also we use mediated learning principles for providers' interaction with parents, as well as for parents' interaction with toddlers. And so again, the underlying purpose is active engagement in the learning process. And so in any case, the virtual learning environment did support the intervention's greater reliance on conceptual learning rather than a how-to approach that providers were modeling for parents. As I said, so one central process in our intervention is using video-supported learning, in which not just in addition to the video examples that I just described, we also have a process of providers guiding parents' reflection on parent-child interaction that we record, that we video recorded each session. So they play back those videos and have a guided video reflection on them, in which they're looking at parents' kind of success that parents have seen that sometimes they miss, success that in how what they did, their use of media learning principles, how that translated into child actions. This is important. Both kind of video elements are important because these are the it's important that that neither of them were negatively affected by the virtual delivery, because both of those are features for which we receive very positive feedback from parents. Often they'll say, this is the best feature of the intervention, the examples that you show, and also the video reflection, the reflection of their interaction with their own toddler. Data collection happened via Zoom. It happened pretty seamlessly. That was not a problem. And we collect video and audio data. And then the bottom line is, fortunately, these problems with retention that we're currently experiencing, we will be able to continue with through the end of the project with the approval of a no-cost extension. So I think the project should be fine from that standpoint. So that's the end for me, Allison.
Thank you, Hannah. If you're just joining us, we're just talking about the COVID-19 research pivots and lessons learned, and this is an interactive panel. I did put some directions in the chat as far as if you have questions for the panelists, if you could put them in the chat, and if it's for a specific panelist, if you could include that panelist's name. What we're going to do is allow all the panelists to present first briefly, and then we'll use the rest of the time to do Q&A. So please go ahead and feel free to put your questions in the chat as each of us talks, and we'll hold all the questions till after everyone's had the chance to briefly talk about their project. So next we'll go to Melanie.
Thanks, Allison. Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Pelagia. I am an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And I will be talking with you about some of the work that I've been doing through an early career development and mentoring award. So right now I am in the 4th year of that award. And when the pandemic hit 2 years ago, obviously I was in the 2nd year of that award. And the goal of this project is to develop a toolkit of implementation strategies targeted towards improving Part C early intervention providers' use of parent coaching for families of young autistic children. So similar theme and a story to the presentation we just heard from Hannah in terms of the population being served. Largely when this, when the pandemic struck this project, we were in the middle of collecting direct observation data. And so although the goal of the project overall is to develop a toolkit of implementation strategies, the methods that we proposed to develop that toolkit involved a lot of direct observation and community partnered work with Philadelphia's Part C early intervention system. And so we were planning to do a lot of our observations, or all of our observations, directly in families' homes, working with the providers who are providing services to families in their homes, doing a lot of qualitative interviewing with families, with providers, with early intervention system administrators and various community stakeholder groups to learn about their perspectives towards using parent coaching, with the end goal of helping them implement more parent coaching. When the pandemic landed upon this project and upon our world, we had conducted some observations in person at that point. And obviously, when the world shut down, we were no longer going into families' homes to conduct direct observations. The early intervention system in Philadelphia quickly pivoted to a telehealth service delivery model, and we worked closely with them to figure out how we can continue collecting our data and observing what was happening with families through the telehealth modality. So it was a quick pivot, like I'm sure happened to all of you who are doing research in this time. I think one thing that was really important for us is that although it was really challenging, it allowed us to explore parent and provider perspectives to coaching at a much more granular level because everyone had now shifted to a parent coaching model within this Part C service system. And so before the pandemic, obviously providers were often working directly with children. We were hoping to increase the use of parent coaching through this project. And just as a matter of what providers were able to do with families of young children, they all, were largely reporting that they were using more parent coaching. So there was a large push across the county to, shore up their procedures for parent coaching, which was, lucky for us in this project that we were already studying the use of parent coaching and working with them to figure out how to improve its implementation. So providers reported that they used a lot more parent coaching, but when we continued to observe those sessions, we actually didn't see an increase in the use of evidence-based parent coaching strategies. And so something that we learned from this process is that although providers reported using a lot of parent coaching, our observations didn't indicate that they were actually using high quality evidence-based parent coaching strategies. Which again, for us, further highlighted the need to support high quality evidence-based parent coaching for providers. They were talking to families, they were engaging with them, they were certainly spending a lot of time with the parents, but they weren't necessarily spending more time coaching them as they thought they were doing. So that was an important finding for us that, I think supported this work. Another thing that we learned through this project was that the remote service delivery really increased the flexibility for providers who were working with families. So providers were able to, eliminate travel to families' homes from their work schedule. And so they could schedule families back to back, which they felt would increase access to care for families. So more families would be able to access services now because they could schedule 5 families a day instead of just 3, for example, since they weren't driving around the city. So that was an exciting potential advantage to the telehealth model. Another thing that we learned through this process was, not surprisingly, there was a lot of caregiver strain and burnout, like, is common for the rest of the world going through this. But when we talked with families through our qualitative interview process, despite all of the caregiver strain and burnout, overwhelmingly, the parents wanted more coaching. They liked the idea of being involved in sessions more. They liked the idea of learning how to support their children's development and needs. And so we saw that it potentially increased parent empowerment during a time that families had really little control over their environment. And so the idea of using the telehealth service platform to, work with families was something that was potentially noteworthy for increasing their empowerment. And then one thing that was really striking for us that we learned during our time working with families and providers during the pandemic and through our qualitative interviews was that we were unfortunately learning about inequities in access to care. And so providers definitely highlighted that they were less likely to coach families who were from minoritized backgrounds, that they were less likely to coach families who were coming from, challenging home situations or didn't have access to good, telehealth capabilities. And so there were many families who were being disproportionately left out of this service during the pandemic, which we know likely increased the disparities in access to care for families who were already being, the hardest hit by the pandemic in many ways. So it was really striking for us to, hear that directly from the providers when we spoke with them about, the challenges to using coaching during the pandemic. And there were pretty obvious and striking findings related to, increasing these disparities in access to coaching. So I think I think overall, we were in a position, unfortunately, that we were able to dive into this because we were positioned and already studying the use of coaching. And when the pandemic sort of forced the entire EI system to move to this treatment modality, we were, lucky to be able to dive in deeper and study that. It was certainly, a quick pivot and a quick change, but I think we were probably one of the few who were positioned to be able to dive into that. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Melanie. Okay, so we'll go on to our next panelist, Megan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Carbonine at the University of Kansas, and I'm going to talk about a pivot that we did in a project related to a professional development intervention. Sarah Cobley, my co-PI, is largely responsible for helping to make sure that this pivot happened the way it did, and so I needed to acknowledge her as well. So this is a project that is focusing on improving the quality of science education and science outcomes for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who are eligible for statewide alternate assessments. So these are students who are also sometimes referred to as having extensive support needs. And we have a professional development model that combines multidimensional science standards, an inquiry-based approach to science, and universal design for learning in its design. And the goal is that those three are woven together in the way instruction is provided, but also that they are woven together in what teachers experience in the PD that we provide, which is based on modules and coaching. So it's very complex design work. There's a lot of deep thinking that has to happen to be able to really organize and synthesize those kind of core threads within the model, and then put it all back together kind of under the hood so that what teachers experience is still useful and impactful. So COVID has hit us a couple of times. It's wreaking havoc with our field test data collection due to Omicron. But when Allison organized this session, the pivot that was more on my mind was the one that we had to make in a development iteration. So in March of 2020, we were on target for a summer institute where we were going to bring in teachers who had participated in our usability testing, partnering science educators and special educators with project staff to do a lot of deep co-design work in a 1-week on-site session. And obviously when that didn't work out, we pivoted to a 2-week model that allowed for a series of synchronous and asynchronous activities that were designed a little bit differently than we had planned, and with slightly different staffing and different ways of working. So the model turned out to be that we had pairs of teachers working together with a group facilitator in separate Zoom rooms, and there were points in time where the groups came together to have conversations about fidelity to the model, where we were learning lessons along the way. We hadn't done a summer institute before. All we had done was test prototypes of previous modules. It was interesting. In our center, we've probably adapted formerly on-site events for 12 different things. And this is the only one I can think of where we really, they took a lot of steps to replicate the idea of sitting in a room together. So in their 2-hour sessions together, they'd be on Zoom with their video on, and they might be doing some independent work, but then they would unmute so that they could have a quick little conversation and troubleshoot something that they were working on in their design work. So it was much more of a mimicking that face-to-face than a lot of our other panel work has been. The design process that they went through in converting to virtual, we ended up using several different tools that I think helped with that remote and virtual experience and facilitation. Each of the educators worked first with what we called a storyline concept map. So it was kind of their place where they were brainstorming the look and feel of the modules that they were developing. It provided enough of a architecture and support that we were trying to aim for uniformity within the set of modules, get it that we had a lot of people, different people designing them. It helped them really kind of make sure they were attending to key parts of the 3-part model in our theoretical framework. And then the tendency was to kind of go straight to what are the instructional activities I would design. And we really wanted them to first grapple deeply with the science content. So it really helped kind of keep that tendency a little bit more in check and really kind of work them through a more systematic process. After that storyline concept map, they translated their ideas into a slide deck, which we at first thought was just going to be PowerPoint. But we quickly realized that the virtual collaboration that we needed to happen, that Google Slides was going to work better. The teachers who were involved were all extremely comfortable in the Google Suite and knew how to work together in it. So that was a quick pivot into, even within the event, we made these modifications to the concept maps, to the slide approaches as we went. So sort of pivot within pivot. Once they kind of built out their module plan a little bit more kind of in slides and with certain directions to our people who are translating the information into the final form, we had folks on standby who translated it into Articulate Rise 360, which is, it allows us to include more interactive features, has a better look and feel and usability, and can be exported as a SCORM package for later use. That system also has a review feature embedded, so you can be reviewing a draft of what you're going to see kind of in the way that you thought you were going to see it and be able to embed comments. So the folks who kind of put those together were able to give them back to the teachers who are doing the design work, and they were able to see how well their ideas translated into the final form, and were able to make some additional adjustments in a way that we wouldn't have been able to if we were just trying to get through the initial design work in a very condensed week. So they were able to include things that kind of increased the amount of specificity in the directions that they were giving to the teachers who were participating. They were able to react quickly to some of the peer edits that were coming in through that system. So that three-step process really kind of helped support the design and really improve that ability for group facilitators to quickly see if there were patterns of things that might not be going as expected for a single teacher module writer, or if there was maybe a pattern of something that needed to be adjusted that might cause us to kind of bring the whole group back together again. In general, like we were trying to look for what some of the unexpected benefits were. And certainly the first and foremost for us is the original design was that we were going to do this as a one-week summer institute and then have to translate it to a virtual model. So the good news is that we built a virtual model, and now we just need to use the lessons that we learned to tweak it. So I think the one that we need to run this summer, not only is there less work to do in trying to think about how to redesign, but I think we're probably going to be potentially even developing higher quality material in this next iteration as a result of having built it that way to begin with. The stretching it out to 2 weeks and giving them 2 hours of synchronous, 2 hours of asynchronous, and then time alone gave them a lot more time for deeper processing. And it also allowed us to bring in staff we wouldn't have been able to. So for instance, we had a very solid science educator who works with this population of students and has a child with significant disabilities himself. He would not have been able to travel to come to an on-site, and he was able to be part of this. I think the ability to use those tools to iterate quickly within, improve that kind of peer-to-peer sharing was kind of critical. I think the scheduling flexibility that gave us so many benefits was kind of a mixed bag, and it's almost like what we all experience going to virtual conferences is people think you're still there. And so you might be at a virtual conference, but there are also the people who still think you're available to read email and such. So those kind of constraints of like what the family in the next room thinks you're available for or not, we just had to kind of negotiate some boundaries around what the work time looked like and what was reasonable in trying to like care for people in the chaos of the early phase of the pandemic. So we've got some ideas for what we would tweak next time, but I think that's about all I plan to share today. So thanks.
Thank you, Megan. And I see there are a couple questions in the chat. Thank you for posting your questions. And I'll just repeat that we will be asking all questions of the panelists at the end after each of us have had a chance to briefly present. So we'll hold all those for now. And our next presenter is Carrie.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks for organizing and keeping us on track in this session. My name is Carrie Shogren. I'm from the University of Kansas. I'm a professor in the Department of Special Education and direct our University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. I'm going to very briefly highlight two of the projects that we had ongoing during the pandemic, where we were in active data collection and had to make some very quick decisions about pivoting and figuring out how to continue to move forward. So we didn't pause either of these projects and continued to move them forward. I also should acknowledge that I'm here speaking about these projects today, but several of my collaborators and other people that support these projects and others are also on the line today. So I'm bringing forward knowledge that we've all kind of grown and shared in together. But first, let me just give you kind of a very quick overview of the two projects. One was a development project. We were actually developing a new technology app that we're calling the Goal Setting Challenge app, to take an intervention that was actually the focus of the second project I'll mention, the self-determined learning model of instruction, and put it in a web-based app delivery framework. So we started this project before COVID, never knowing that having access to some of these online technology tools would be helpful during the pandemic, but also not realizing the disruptions we were all going to face. So when the pandemic started, we were in the middle of our second year of the project, doing single case studies to kind of test feasibility. So we'd done the initial development, we just got it started rolling with schools. And as you all can imagine, doing single case designs when schools in the world completely shut down was highly disruptive. You know, talking about pivots now and the changes we're making now, as we all know during that time, sustaining was not really an option. It was school scrambling to get everyone home, get everyone safe, you know, figuring out what virtual instruction was going to look like. So especially where we were, we tried to best support teachers we could to figure out, as schools started setting up remote learning and figuring out what that could look like, how we could continue to support them. So it became much more learning from students and teachers to really figure out how to deliver a technology-based intervention in virtual classrooms. And I should note, I apologize, this was with high school students. So we were dealing with all of the complexities of adolescence and keeping them engaged, and then doing this during COVID. So I think one of the big things for us is continuing to consider how data, especially to try to establish feasibility of an intervention like this, can be used in meaningful ways, because we were not able to continue data collection. We were able to come back and support a handful of students that were in the original case studies, single case studies, to continue on. But we also found that students were highly impacted. Several of them were not engaging in virtual instruction as we went through the spring of 2020. They were instead working, they were supporting their families, they were doing other things, especially some of our students in under-resourced schools and from marginalized backgrounds. But we were able to learn during that semester, the third year of the project, which was in the fall of 2020 and through 2021, we're now in a no-cost extension year currently, was really focused on doing a small randomized controlled trial. So we really had to figure out how to take this intervention that we were going to be implementing in classrooms with teachers and students and do that in a virtual framework, especially in that fall, and then transitioning into hybrid. So we really had to learn a lot about how to support teachers, to support students, to engage through Zoom, through whatever platform the schools that we were working with were using. We were also across multiple schools across different states. So even navigating issues to the different ways that students were accessing learning was a major issue that impacted us in this project. But we managed to do support and get students engaged with instruction during that RCT year, and to actually get data from treatment and control groups months, letting us look at what implementation looked like during COVID and then in hybrid instruction in the spring of 21. Our other project was a little bit different. Again, using another intervention, we were implementing this in inclusive secondary high school core content classes with students with and without disabilities to enhance self-determination. And it was a longitudinal efficacy trial. So we were working with schools that we'd been in the schools already for 2 years at this point. We had longstanding relationships. We were trying to collect longitudinal data of the impact of this intervention. We were actually looking at different types of supports for teachers and the impact of student outcomes. So one of our conditions was just online resources that teachers received after training, so that the online resources at least could stay stable even as we switched to virtual instruction. However, the other component was in-person coaching. So in that condition, we really had to deal with the dueling issues of switching from in-person coaching to issues related to doing all virtual coaching, as well as supporting teachers to all of a sudden use an intervention that they delivered in classrooms in person with students to a virtual framework. Again, this is where technology and the infrastructure that was already in place, already putting materials into schools, Google Classrooms or other tools they were using, was essential to enable us to keep moving forward. But one of the big issues that we encountered was just maintaining schools, teachers, and students over time. We were able to maintain several of our schools even during the pandemic with interruptions. For example, we had 2 schools that withdrew for 1 semester because they just could not integrate this into everything that they were doing, but came back into the project. We had additional issues with bringing in the additional cohorts. We were actually starting to work with 9th grade classrooms. We're going to add in 10th grade and then 11th grade over time. Building those new relationships with teachers, asking them to take on additional responsibilities during the pandemic was a challenge. So we were really dealing with attrition, and this is something we're going to be continuing to look at in our data analysis, and I'm sure many others are struggling with this. We had both school level attrition, meaning that an entire school dropped out because they were focusing on different priorities, different issues. We also had teachers. We've had several teachers that have either exited their job and gone on to do something else, who have been in and out with their own COVID-related impacts, or who just could not integrate this into what they were doing on an ongoing basis. And then also student level attrition. So even if we were able to maintain schools and teachers, a lot of student movement, a lot of students kind of moving in and out of intervention, both for health factors. We also, again, with adolescents, especially our older adolescents, had a number of students who were exiting to work to support families, to address other needs that were coming up in their homes and their communities. So lots of ongoing issues, both in terms of the data that we were able to collect, with implications, I think, for delivering in virtual and hybrid formats, but also really thinking about what that pre-COVID and post-COVID data and implementation was, because implementation shifted so significantly from the in-person to the virtual school environments. So several of the things, the bullets here about the university school partnerships that I'll just quickly run through and then turn it over to Allison for her comments. Really, the technology infrastructure was critical for us. Ongoing data collection was only possible because we'd started these projects with technology-based supports in schools for collecting data. In many ways, that had been something we've been building to because technology is becoming so ubiquitous, but this really allowed us to have some seamlessness with schools. But one of the ongoing issues was it was much easier to come into in-person environments and bring in technology and websites and coach and support teachers and students to access those things. Doing that in the very complex virtual environment when it wasn't integrated into the systems that teachers were using for other things because we were a research project, introduced a lot of challenges and a lot of extra support needs just in terms of getting teachers and students with access to some of those pieces. Also, just the changing and the different supports for teachers and students during virtual learning. We actually found, it was interesting for us kind of as we were starting to think more and more about virtual option or more hybrid options as we've moved through COVID. At first, teachers were very open to having everything continue to happen virtually. They didn't necessarily want to be thinking about in-person coaching supports again, even when that was an option. But we're seeing a real shift now where people are really craving a lot of that connection, those deeper connections, those opportunities to be receiving supports, even not directly about intervention. We're having a lot of conversations about what this is going to mean for ongoing coaching, what coaching looks like in the future, and also what it means from a workforce perspective, given the high rates of turnover of teachers we're seeing and the anecdotal reports of people that may not be choosing to stay in the teaching profession because of how challenging these past several years have been. And again, this also relates to these attrition level factors and especially student level attrition issues. We're only beginning to really look at our data, but I think it's pretty clear that our student level attrition was much higher in the under-resourced schools that we were working in. Students who are already marginalized in school systems, continuing to engage them in virtual learning and in hybrid models was an ongoing challenge that really creates a lot of ongoing needs that we're going to have to address. I will say too that one of the positive things and one of the ways I think that we were able to maintain our relationships with schools and keep our work going is that we've received a lot of feedback both from teachers and students and done some qualitative studies now of just how important having some ability to identify goals, to kind of think about what it means to continue to try to build self-determination into this transition planning and secondary education process was really something that was beneficial in navigating all the chaos. So when teachers could ask students to be thinking about the goals that they were working on, this really provided a way for them to keep students thinking about the longer term goals and what they were hoping to achieve, which was the purpose of the interventions. However, prioritizing this among all of the competing demands that teachers and students were facing was something that was an ongoing struggle in planning for when, where, and how instruction could occur. So I'm sure that there are many other things that I could share, but I know we'll have more questions that come up in the discussion, but really just a lot of impacts on research. And I think continuing to see the issues that this is introducing for students and teachers as they're navigating the kind of new COVID world that we're living in. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. So I will talk next about a project that I'm leading. It's called the College and Career Readiness for Transition, and it's a measurement project. We actually had not started data collection in the spring of 2020. So at the time, we had school partners lined up, but we were supposed to start data collection in the fall of 2020. So there was sort of an initial kind of panic and scramble with our partners that we had planned to work with. Some had decided they couldn't do it. Some had, weren't sure, and we needed to talk through what changes we could make so that it would be feasible for them. So there was a lot of different school partners that were sort of in different places through the spring and going into the fall. I had already planned to administer the CCR4T using an online platform. So that turned out to be a good idea because that's what we needed to do in the fall of 2020. So that was good. But we had planned for it to be, have somewhat of a teacher directed in-person piece to the administration. So that had to change, obviously. We wanted to make it entirely online administration so that students could potentially do it as a distance learning activity if they were virtually learning entirely. So we decided, instead of issuing links to take it as we initially had planned so that it would be conducive to a classroom context, we decided to change it to where students were actually sent links via their email accounts, which seems sort of like a minor change and shift, but at the same time, high school students, I should have mentioned that this was high school students. High school students may or may not have been used to using their email, checking their email, finding certain emails within their inbox. I think we had schools sort of in many different places around those kinds of skills. Some schools had already shifted and started using email quite a bit because of what was going on in the spring. So by the time the fall arrived, they felt pretty good about that. Some schools were still sort of struggling with being able to use email as an effective way to communicate with students and rely on them submitting work and basically using it as a tool. So that was another shift, but at the same time, it was an important shift, and we had a lot of anecdotal conversations with school partners about how it was helpful to add that email component in, and it is in its sense a college and career readiness skill to have students be more be able to use email and be fluent with it and understand sort of how it works as it does in the working world. So that was an interesting revelation that we had. So we also, when we were recruiting new school partners, because we needed to recruit more since we had some attrition for the fall of 2020, we did emphasize the flexibility of the in-person or distance learning activity, and that schools could do it either way, and that was helpful to be flexible in that way. We also worked with school partners to better understand what kind of data could be useful for them to come out of this. Initially, this is a measurement project, so we had already proposed to provide data reports to schools, most of which were more group level mean comparison reports across our domain scores that the CCR4T measures. We were already planning to do that to a certain extent, but we really built that feature out because we recognized that our school partners really needed data. They needed to be able to see and process data in different ways to understand how their students were doing with all these different shifts and changes. So we actually collected data on in-person or hybrid versus fully virtual students. We actually had that as a coded variable in our data set for our fall 2020 field test. And then we were able to make some comparisons between learners who were fully virtual versus learners who were hybrid. I don't believe any of our schools at this point were fully in person. The ones who were considered in person were hybrid, meaning they would go in person a couple of days a week and then be virtual for the remainder of the week. So we were able to make some comparisons with those data reports and show our school partners some differences between those different learning modalities, which certainly was not in our initial proposal or our research plan or in any of our research questions. So that was just an interesting way to think about using data and helping school partners to use data to make some decisions in the current context. I also changed some budget stuff around and made it so I could provide some school stipends to our partners. We didn't initially have that in our budget, and that's always an important piece to work into your budget if you don't already, and I'm sure many of you already know that, but it really seemed to matter in the fall of 2020 to be able to provide a school stipend to our school partners. So we were providing them with data reports as well as that school stipend. Those incentives really helped to maintain those partnerships through all the challenges that the schools were facing. And that's about it for my project. We have a lot of questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do now is I'll stop sharing. This last slide is pretty straightforward. As I mentioned at the beginning of the interactive session, we have our panelists who talked through their projects and their pivots. And then now what I will do is go back to the chat, which many of you have already put questions in it. And I'll go back to the top and we will open it up for questions. So if you think of questions as we're talking, please go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. And it does help if you have a question for a specific panelist to put their name, as many of you have already done. Thank you for that. So let's go to the top. There was a question for Hannah from Carl. It says, you mentioned family stress. Did you have an opportunity to measure or identify the levels of stress experienced by families?
Yes, thanks for the question, Carl. This is just a small development project with a very small N. So we didn't measure it in this project. It wasn't not one of our research questions, and we didn't collect data on it. However, we have had some recent discussions about considering in a future, we do have an application in for an RCT to extend this development project into an RCT. If that gets approved, that is something that we will consider. We considered the possibility of building in a mindfulness resource to address some of these issues, optional for parents. So that's one thing that we've thought about. Also, we've done some preliminary development of an instrument to assess parent self-efficacy specifically related to parenting toddlers with autism. And we also did a qualitative, and the reason I mention that is because we did a qualitative study of parent self-efficacy for parents who had experienced both the model I described and or a version of it, and who had also had experience with a traditional provider-directed early intervention model. And it seemed in those findings that stress appeared to ease as parent learning was supported and as they assumed a stronger role in the intervention. So we felt that stress was pretty related to parent self-efficacy, and I can put a reference for that into the chat in a minute if you like. Yeah, I could do that.
Thanks, Hannah.
Sure.
And the next question is for Melanie from Brian. Did Part C providers' discussion of having more difficulty supporting racially minoritized families or those living in more challenging circumstances affect your thoughts about the implementation toolkit you're developing?
Thanks for that question, Brian. So yes, absolutely. When we conceptualized this implementation toolkit, we did not originally even consider including modules to support coaching for families who are coming from minoritized backgrounds. But we've since developed the toolkit and are pilot testing it right now. And we included modules specifically for providers to learn concrete strategies to support families who they would maybe not consider coaching. And so there are some concrete supports that are included in these additional modules that we added based on these qualitative findings. We are pilot testing it now, and hopefully we find that it leads to providers coaching all families more effectively instead of choosing which families they perceive as being a good fit for coaching. So we'll see if it works.
Thanks, Melanie. The next question is for Megan from Jennifer. Do you have a document that describes the technology you used and how you used it?
There's not one coherent document right now. It's mostly a mix of the things that I talked about before. So Zoom, Skype for IM. We started with Word for the storyline concept maps, Google Slides, and then the last one was Articulate Rise. That may be the least familiar, so I'm just pasting the URL for that one in here. But we're kind of working toward a distilled description, so I'm also happy to follow up by email if you're interested in more.
Thanks, Megan. The next question is for all panelists. Did COVID onset cause you to change your research questions, even adding questions about coping with COVID? Does anybody on the panel want to start with that one?
I'm happy. I can just say that we're doing a lot of qualitative work through this project, and we didn't have COVID related questions in our qualitative interview guide when we planned it, but clearly we couldn't not talk about it because whenever we spoke with families, with providers, it was at the forefront of their minds. And so we, found ourselves adding questions related to how COVID has impacted the types of services that they provide for families, how it impacts their overall family well-being and stress. And so we certainly did dive very deeply into the qualitative work related to COVID, which was obviously not a plan.
I can add that I have the exact same answer as Melanie. We've also have a mixed method study and have been interviewing providers and families after completion of the study. And so we're getting a lot of data that we'll be able to analyze related to that. And you're right, it's front and center of their minds.
Megan, did you want to answer?
I'm watching the mute and unmute, trying to figure out who's going next. We're all being very polite. Yeah, so in our study, we're scheduled to start the pilot this coming fall. That's our randomized study. So right now our field test is single group pre-post. In our pilot, we have planned a mixed method study that is the qualitative is by site. So we're not looking necessarily at individual factors that influence individual teachers, but more so factors that influence site implementation and outcomes. But what we've had to do in this field test phase is almost kind of bring aspects of the research question that's planned for the pilot into our thinking about the field test. So what are the contextual factors that are influencing teachers' experiences, their implementation with fidelity, their outcomes as teachers? So we're bringing some of those things in a little bit earlier than we had planned, and then doing much more rigorous data mining, like much more extensive debriefing with the instructional coaches than what we would have planned to do, relying a lot more on site coordinators for kind of up-to-date information about what's happening with the COVID context in their site, to what degree are they not able to staff schools. So some of those things that we hadn't had to do, but we're planned for next year. Just knowing that they were coming, I think made it a little bit easier for us to start wrapping those in now.
Yeah, and I would add for us, we've tried to maintain to the degree possible the research questions we were trying to address, but it's hard, right? All of us know that we're running projects through this. I can say for our ongoing longitudinal trial, we're really trying to test out, can we actually build a longitudinal model, or what changes are we actually seeing in students? Like, is there actually COVID related impacts in the data for some of our primary outcome measures? So we're exploring those things. I don't have great answers to share yet. We've also added in, especially during COVID, we were actually dealing with, over the course of that project, the original in-person learning experience, a fully virtual experience, then a hybrid experience, then back to somewhat more in-person, especially in some of our schools. It did depend on the region we were in. So we're trying to look at those different groups and are we going to see any differences, both in issues related to fidelity, time in instruction, as well as student outcomes. As everyone knows, issues related to power and other factors are going to be issues that we get into there. But we're trying to add in as many of those kind of additional secondary analyses as we can. Like others have mentioned as well, we were doing focus groups on implementation. And so adding in COVID-related questions to that. Also trying to get indicators of teacher and student stress, which we weren't really able to add in concrete measures until kind of the ending of these projects. We won't have great data on there. So I think in some ways my answer to that question is that it's yet to be determined exactly how it's going to impact all of our analyses. We're kind of in the midst of all of that right now. And there are these questions about how we can meaningfully put together any of this data, especially with some of our longitudinal models. And then especially in our one project where we were fully implementing during this period with that technology-based app, I mean, it really is now going to be a test of, what's the impact of this during the pandemic. So it's going to raise additional questions of what do we do in whatever our kind of ongoing situation is in schools to test if these interventions are going to operate the same way as they did before, during, and, again, whatever after looks like.
Yeah, and I'll just add that for us, we like Carrie did with her projects, we've tried really hard to stick with the original research questions as much as possible and not deviate too much. But yes, it is very hard. The context has changed. And so we've certainly been handling that as best we can. I mentioned that we were looking at differences between virtual and in-person / hybrid learners as part of our first round of field testing in fall of 2020. And then in this school year, which is 21-22, we're collecting data for our second field test, and all of our learners are really very in person. There's really not any virtual learners this year that are participating. So that's brought up a lot of other questions about the measure development process and what that means, to have such a different context between the two field tests. So I think that we're grappling with that and trying to kind of figure out how to work some of those questions into the long-term findings and sort of how to, handle it as part of field test too. The next question is from Joy. It says, it seems like many of you were fortunate in having virtual aspects and/or relationships already in place. Any advice for those of us just starting out? And I can comment on that first and then open it up to the rest of the panelists. For myself, for our project, I mentioned that we actually really hadn't started our data collection yet. So we kind of were starting out in many ways when March of 2020 happened. So while we did sort of have somewhat, I wouldn't say we had a strongly established relationship with any school partners at that point. We had just started recruiting. So it really wasn't, it really was very much like starting out in that way. And I think it was really important for us to work with our school partners to talk to them about, what do you need? What can you get out of this besides like kind of revisit the incentives that we said we would offer, and really think about, okay, we're going to be able to offer you data. How might that be helpful for you? What do you need right now this semester? What kind of data would be helpful? And that was really where the idea came to compare the virtual versus hybrid learners, because schools had no idea what that looked like, how that was going, and they didn't really have any kind of evaluation system set up to be able to examine that well. So that's just one example of what we tried to do as a group that was more in that starting out position when the pandemic did happen, or start, I should say. I'm sure many of the other panelists have things to say though. So anybody else want to answer that one?
I would just say, don't let it scare you. People are pretty literate with Zoom and email, and we found that early intervention providers were well set up for virtual communications, and it wasn't particularly a problem. And of course, the pivot to fully, to virtual visits was for families was more difficult. But in terms of just building up a system of communication with providers, I wouldn't say that was challenging.
Yeah, I agree with what Allison and Hannah said as well. And I think in some ways, it was the existing relationships that allowed us to continue. And I think it really reinforces for all of us how important building those relationships is with our district partners, with schools, whether it's COVID or not. But I think COVID has further exacerbated that and really forces us to continue to think about kind of meeting and understanding where schools are. We had to do a lot of assessing as we were figuring out what implementation was going to continue to look like, of understanding what were schools going to be using for their technology platforms, what pivots did we need to make sure that anything that we were sharing was going to minimize any burdens and impacts on them, but was instead going to support them. And so I think that again, COVID or not, approaching this from kind of building those relationships and understanding where your partners are and how what we're doing to kind of advance education research is done in partnerships with the needs of those schools. And in many ways, a lot of the technology supports flow from that and build on that in terms of what schools are needing and are using and really what that looks like for them.
I was going to say something really similar to what Carrie just said in terms of the relationship question for, those that are the question was for those of us that are starting out with relationships. I think, this is a really trying time for everyone. And I think as you are building those relationships and trying to advance research questions, it's important for those research questions to be important to the community partners that you're working with and to, as much as possible, not push your own research agenda and to think about what are the questions and the methods that are not intrusive and that are building those relationships and partnerships, because I think ultimately that is what will help move all of the work forward.
Yeah, there's nothing that I could say more eloquently about relationships than what the other panelists have already said. So I would agree with all of that. In terms of the thinking about virtual from the beginning, I was reflecting on that question, and I think, our project, our intervention is designed kind of with the ultimate end goal in mind, assuming that it does turn out to be effective in changing teachers' practice and changing outcomes for students. We knew that our target population sometimes can be a bunch of teachers in a self-contained school, or you could be the one teacher who's isolated in a very rural district. And so we built this to be virtual and flexible from the beginning within kind of the constraints of standardization needed to implement a model with fidelity and test it out. And so I think trying to be cognizant of that need for variability versus standardization from the beginning is kind of what got us to that point of assuming that virtual was going to be a model that would help support that.
Thank you. So the next question is for Carrie from Lauren. Can you talk more about your strategies to effectively answer your research questions given the school, teacher, and student level attrition you described? What were the impacts on data collection and analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for the question. And in some ways, I think we all already talked a little bit about this in terms of how it kind of impacted our research questions or those additions. I think that especially in terms of the attrition, we've been trying to be very, very structured as we're approaching analyzing our data in terms of really understanding attrition at all of those levels. I think and maybe others were better about this. I was always, thinking about, well, we've got this much student attrition or we lost this many teachers, instead of really thinking a lot about the interaction across those levels and the factors that were having kind of cascading impacts and even what that meant for students. I mentioned, for example, that we were doing some additional, focus groups, and we added in some one-on-one interviews with students, especially those that we could stay in touch with, just to even understand what was going on in their classrooms, what was going on in their lives, so we could better understand some of those things that were contributing to attrition. So I think trying to piece some of that out and really think about, I know I've been seeing lots of comments in the chat in terms of what do we count as attrition, where do kind of these natural events fit into that. But for me, I've just found it really interesting to think about the pushes that, especially at that teacher level, are leading to much more attrition than we've ever had of teacher participants, and what that really means in terms of kind of understanding the student level outcomes, but as well as the teacher level outcomes.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm now seeing there's a series of questions that are kind of more directed towards IES and WWC. So it sounds like Joan would like to be able to address those directly. So I'll turn it over to her.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Excellent. This has been a great session, and I'm just going to take a little bit more time than you're probably giving me, but I just wanted to say that people are desperate to talk about their experiences and what happened and get new ideas. And so this has been enormously helpful. What I worried about from the get-go was that, people would think about, oh, they tried this, I can try it too. So, know that, if you're thinking of these things, talk with your program officer, because, they can help you think through research questions and pivots that you can take. Our goal is to get projects done with high quality and to meet the objectives as best you can. And, sort of that's how we went into the pandemic, and we've been trying to be very flexible, but just make sure you're staying in touch with your program officer to talk about this. Okay, the real question I'm supposed to answer is about the WWC. And we have frantically been having side conversations around Nixer staff to try to find the answer of how that would be handled. And Sarah Brazel put in the standards 4.1 treatment of natural disasters. We have seen the draft 5.0 standards, and they have the similar kind of language. So they haven't addressed COVID specifically. So I think what we should do is, on our side, we can take that back and talk to WWC and say, are you thinking that COVID is a natural disaster, or are you going to come up with different guidance and try to get that out to the field? But I think it's a good indication that there is some thinking there about, whether it's different, it affects differentially treatment and control, and if it doesn't, then we don't have to worry so much about it as if it does really affect one group more than the other. So anyway, stay tuned. I don't know how to get the information to people. I'd appreciate good ideas. I mean, we could send it out to everybody in a news blast, or a program officer could handle it from their perspective, but obviously it would be good to talk to not only people that are in this virtual room now, but across the two research centers for whatever they focus on. So we'll have to think a little bit more about that, and welcome any ideas that you put into the chat. Thank you, and thank you all so much. This has been a great session.
Thank you. We had most of the questions I think were answered in the chat, maybe not all, but we only have a couple more minutes. So I noticed that Stephanie had a question for everyone about going back to interview teachers this year about their experiences last year in terms of trying to explain the context. And that does speak to a question that we were trying to emphasize throughout, which was this idea of pre-COVID versus post-COVID cohort comparisons, and just that idea in general. So would any of the panelists like to comment a little bit about some of that and moving forward and looking at sort of pre-COVID versus post-COVID comparisons, or any other shifts?
We have a kind of unique design where our field test participants this year are going to be follow along next year, so they can continue using the same resources and modules along the way. So we have had the problem of attrition related to the Omicron variant this year, but those that do continue on, I'm definitely going to be adding some questions about COVID to that protocol when that comes around.
All right, any other last comments from the panelists about anything? Well, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you everybody for your questions. And the next session will start at 1 p.m. Eastern, so you have 15-minute break to enjoy. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.